Welcome everyone to our Kepler College Book Club author Q&A. My name is Misty Lane and I'm your book club admin. I'm here today with Dr. Lee Lehman, author of our June book of the month, Classical Solar Returns. Lee has a Ph.D. from Rutgers University. She has written 11 books, that's a lot, on horary, electional, mundane, medical, and solar returns. She taught every year during Kepler College's academic period where she was academic dean, and she is the principal of the medical program at the School of Traditional Astrology. Lee has received the Mark Edmund Jones Award and the Regulus Award. And again, happy Independence Day to those of us here in the US, and thanks for joining us on this day. I will be keeping an eye out on the chat, so feel free to ask your questions at any point and we'll be sure to get them answered. Otherwise, Lee, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background with astrology?
My background in astrology is too long. Um, now, my background is I got into astrology when I was in graduate school.
Okay.
And so it's one of those dual things because, you have to be obsessed about whatever you're doing your degree on, but then astrology is itself a lifelong obsession.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to be like double obsessed. Um, so I've done it for a long time. My major shift was in the late 80s when I started doing classical work, which I hadn't intended to. But what happened to me was I got captured by William Lilly's Christian Astrology, which was just such a foundational book for me that I pretty much never looked back afterward. So that was the big thing. Um, I think as far as, specifically as far as solar returns, because that's the topic for today. There was a woman by the name of Clara Darr, who probably nobody younger than 50 in the astrological community has heard of. She was a fine teacher with AFA, um, very good astrologer. Turns out that when she got older, she got blind, which I think all of us would recognize as a terrible thing, because we're all bookworms. And this was, of course, before computers could alleviate some of it. So she had a collection of books, which included some seriously old books. And what she wanted to do was, yes, she wanted to sell them, but she wanted to sell them to astrologers. You may not know it, but there's such a market for old books from collectors who could care less about what the title of the book is. And
Mm-hmm.
so they're just lining some bookcase shelves with obviously old books. And she wanted to avoid that. And so I was working with on the board of NCGR at the time. I found out she was interested in this. I thought, well, let's see what she's got. She had some amazing stuff. And I bought as much of it as I could afford at that stage. And one of the books was a book by John Gabber in the 17th century on the topic of solar returns. And what he had done was he had taken the English Civil War, and the English Civil War basically was, to summarize it, Charles I, like all the kings before him, and probably a number of kings after him, always wanted money for wars. And he got the money from the nobility, and the nobility didn't want to pay. I mean, that summarizes English history for a few hundred years. So what happened was that Charles got really vocal about demanding the money. And he got so vocal that the parliament went to war with him. And ultimately, the parliament won, and ultimately, he continued to be politically nearsighted. with the result that he was brought up on treason charges and executed. Now, John Gadbury, who was one of the astrologers at that time, who was fairly well known, did his solar returns for the entire time from I think a couple of years before his problems with the parliament, through the split between the parliament and the king, through the war, and finally to his execution. And so, as a historical document, this was amazing. As an astrological document, it was amazing because he covered this whole sequential thing. One of the things that impressed me about that as a method to work and as a book is that when you have to cover, let's say, 10 consecutive years of somebody's life, you can't hedge around the years where you can't really, or you don't really think you're seeing something. It's one thing when you always get to pick your examples, your examples should look stellar. But when you're doing a series like that, you've got to show the intermediate years, which maybe not a lot was happening, and that's true. And there may be personal stuff where there was something going on, but you just don't know what it is. But he covered that whole. Now, in this case, there were lots of events because there were armies going around England fighting. But it really struck me. And that allowed me to also answer one of the questions that had always come up with solar returns: which location do you use? And so what was very clear from what Gadbury was presenting was he was doing birthplace locations. Well, number one, that simplifies it enormously. It really does, because you can run your solar returns for the next 30 years if you want to. I don't think that's why they did it. I mean, there's some technical things that may be why they did it, but the point is it will work. You may get, there's certain insights you can get from looking at your birthplace, at where you are for the solar return, where you live for that year. But you can get a pretty good, I think what you get with the birthplace solar returns is basically, this is kind of what the blueprint was supposed to be for the year. Now, if you don't like it, do something about it. But that's kind of like the plan. So I started working with it that way. And at the time, I had almost given up on solar returns because you could do the birthplace, you could use the residence, you could do the location, you could do it unprecessed, you could do it precessed. And at that time, Zipporah Dobbins was proposing a third method, which was to do the progressed solar return. So basically, I spent some time trying to work these 9 different solar returns to say, okay, now which one is working better? And the only thing that this produces is a migraine. So it was just too frustrating. So this book by Gadbury just simplified the method enormously for me, which allowed me to see a whole lot more about what its utility was, and to develop that into really the main thing that I do with people in yearly updates. So that was kind of the basis for the book and for the method that I worked with to then get to the book.
Okay. And I want to talk about that really quick, because I did really appreciate you being so candid about your frustrations with solar returns in the book. And it just really made me resonate with that struggle as someone who's at the start of their astrology career, kind of exploring all of my different pathways at this current point. And I find even just not focused on solar returns, but the deeper I get into my astrological studies, you are encountered with all of these contrasting opinions on how to do one thing. And there are so many different ways to take a look at solar returns. There's so many different ways to take a look at even just a natal chart. And I What advice do you have for someone who's really starting out their education and maybe getting overwhelmed by all of these contrasting methods? Just explore it for ourselves like you did?
Well, I think the first off, I think it's way better to know that there are variations
Hmm.
rather than to pretend that there's only one way.
Exactly.
I mean, that's just a piece of uh, practical knowledge. I think, but now, you know, this also depends on your chart as well as the charts of the people that you're reading for. But I think the thing basically is that depends a lot on what you're trying to get out of a chart as to what the method you'll use. Let me give you an example of that. Right now, I'm teaching some material at a school called Astro Campus Virtual, which is a Spanish school. And it's a different medical program than the one we have at Kepler, but there's an overlap. So, Keplerites don't despair, it'll make it over there eventually. But one of the things I'm teaching is a module, which is like our Kepler courses, it's 5 weeks. And the module is on how do you read a chart differently, according to whether you're talking about affairs of the body, the mind, or the spirit. Now, this is an interesting one because how this happens in astrology right now essentially depends on which school of astrology you currently belong to. If you're doing kind of standard 20th, 21st century modern astrology, you would probably look and say, well, the stuff of the body, well, that's kind of sounds like medical, maybe. And so you probably would use medical methods to say, okay, is this person going to get gallbladder? Or are they going to get celiac disease? And there's good methods for that. And there are good methods for that in a number of the different schools. But then when you talk about mental and spiritual, well, now you're in big territory. What does spiritual mean? What does mental mean? How do you look at it? What are you trying to get out of it as a practitioner? If you're looking at mental and you're thinking of mental as essentially a synonym of psychology, well, that's very different than if you were looking at mental with the astrology from, say, 400 years ago. So you've got all sorts of different premises about what you are trying to get out of it. Now, to me, the stuff that I'm interested in is, first of all, there's a whole thing. There's a very interesting thing that happened in the 16th and 17th century. There were these rules for telling the difference according to whether you were working with the house rulers themselves or the planets in a house, because that would tell you different things about whether it was physical or mental. But then what happened was the bloody aristocracy in Europe. And they decided, it's always the aristocracy, right? But now we call it the 1%.
Yeah.
But then you called it the aristocracy. And what happened was it became fashionable to be melancholic. Now, this is really quite funny when you think about it. Who are the melancholics? Well, somewhere in the same period of time, melancholy basically became a semi-synonym of depressed. Now, why ever would you want to walk around being depressed if you didn't have to? I mean,
Exactly.
but it turned to this thing about, well, the scholars are all melancholic temperament. And it was also big at that time, that this was the period of the Reformation, the split between Protestantism and Catholicism. And so now you have to prove that you're the more religious one. And what better way to be more religious than to be convinced at all times that you're going to be damned? And because if you're going to be damned, you might as well just start being depressed right now. And so you have this thing where they start emphasizing this one piece of melancholy, which used to just be you were a black bile temperament, which meant you were earth. So in those days, and this is what you find when you read William Lilly, Lilly very clearly says, if you can't decide on what the temperament is, call them sanguine. Okay? Because the sanguine guys, they're with party guys, and don't you want to be a party guy? Don't you want to sit in the tavern and get drunk tonight? So there was this shift to, what's the right thing to be? So you have this period, and none of the astrology changed. This is what's so fascinating. What changed was people's expectations of what cool looked like. And so this is a kind of a way that they were playing around with their symbol set according to what they thought they wanted to be. And so then they got somewhat different insights out of it than what had been the original insights. But basically, in these days, if you wanted to talk about the mind, if you wanted to talk about the spirit, you talked about Mercury and the moon. Well, you did before that, you did after that. But how you talked about it shifted according to what people were trying to get out of it. And the sanguine types didn't care so much. They weren't locked into being oppressed.
They're like, we can be flexible. It's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, is the ale any good? Uh
Yep. Thinking of what matters.
yep.
Okay, so it's really just about what you want out of it and using that as a starting point, it
I think
sounds.
that's the thing, because
Okay.
ultimately, what has astrology done for you in your life? I mean, that's really the bottom line question for all of us. And if your insights in astrology are coming from your perception of a spiritual journey, then that's the kind of astrology you need to be doing. If your astrological life is coming from the fact that you want to be able to day trade, well, then that's the kind of astrology you should be doing. And there's so many kinds that we can use, and there's so many ways we can be in it, that should be the first thing, is what are you interested in? The next thing is, when you start to study somebody's method, I'm serious about this, one of your first questions should be, is this coherent?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think the point here with coherency is there's a crazy idea in the astrological community, or in much of it, that what you do to become a famous astrologer is you invent something. Bad idea. Not totally, but it's a bad idea in the sense that there's so many of these concepts that are so big that one person can't do it all. And
Mm-hmm.
there's how many times have I gone to lectures, if you go to lectures, where the person gets up there, they've got this cool new method that they're doing where they take a particular, they invent a new aspect, or they invent some relationship between the planets, and you have this, and you have the haha, syndrome. And every chart they show you is from their family. Okay, this is already a bad sign, because it means they haven't really gotten out to trying to work with it in a more universal capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is, and this I think is a matter of integrity. When I sit down to write a lecture, I generally pick my examples before I have a clue what their charts are showing me. And the reason for that is because if the only way you can get the lecture to work is if you spend a god awful amount of time going through charts, till you find the 1 in 100 that worked, this is also not a good thing. Because most of the time we want to start at a fairly universal place. That's what I try to do in solar returns. And that's why I've got those two sections, the two different Roosevelts, where I do sequential years. Even though in some cases I didn't know a whole lot about what was going on in some of the years that weren't the big years for Franklin Roosevelt or
Mhm.
for Theodore Roosevelt. You know, I picked times where, yes, they had big things generally, but not necessarily every year. Um, because you want to first be able to say, which is, I think, another thing about perception of life. Take a decade. How much change goes on in your life in a decade? Quite a bit,
A lot.
a lot. But
Hmm.
then they're going to be the years you sleep through. I mean, honestly, I figure
Yeah.
when I'm talking to clients, you take a decade, 1, maybe 2 years are like the tens, you know, death of a parent. Um, you graduate from school and it actually mattered. You know, you get a job that, well, you get a job or you lose a job that's a really significant one, not your summer job. Um,
Hmm.
and so something happens there, you start a relationship, you end a relationship, the big ones, probably 2, maybe 3 in a decade. You may have a health problem. So we know what generically, the kinds of issues can be. Now, can you use that method that you're playing with to tell those years apart? That's really a good starting place for looking at a new method and saying, now, is this worth my time to do? Now, there are some methods that I've played with because I was interested in them, because I thought they would really punch things well, where they could really do that. And other times, I had a friend a number of years ago who made the statement that she was working with a method where, it might show you something like, today is a physically dangerous day. Okay, now, hey, I want to know if today's a physically dangerous day. But what I couldn't tell you was, but is it you or is it something in your environment? Because what she
Hmm.
noticed about it was that physically dangerous day, you're walking down the street, you see a bus accident. Way different than being in the bus accident.
Way different. Absolutely.
But the method saw that there was something around, but couldn't say, but it involves you. So that's a method that may be almost useless for you because it's like you're getting too many false positives. So those are the kinds of things that I try to look at. Is this something that, because knowing that there's this kind of gadget phenomenon in astrology, where we're always looking for the next new toy. Um,
Hmm.
you have to have something that says, okay, I don't mind seeing toys, but let's see whether it's worth my time to do this in a reading for somebody. Am I going to have egg on my face? Because either they're not going to show up next year because it was so awful, or they're going to say, hey, this was really great that you were able to do this. Or they say, you said what? So, you want to be able to have that feedback where you can really see whether the method holds enough of the time to be worth incorporating. And to me, for most of us get to a point where we have a core method. Somebody who does cosmic biology will tell you absolutely they're getting, they're working with a 90-degree dial. They're working with doing solar arc directions. They see certain patterns, they know what it means. That's what I do with my classical material, that I've gotten a set together that work as a good overlapping set, so that if somebody asks me something, I know where to go. When you get to that set, that's when you're a professional astrologer. So you have to distinguish between the things that you're going to want to use almost every time, and the things that are, gee whiz, if you happen to encounter this thing that happens one time in 1,000, I definitely want to know about that. But you know, it most of the time you're never going to do it. So
So it's
that's
really just about having that tried and true method for you,
mhm.
especially it sounds. Okay.
Yeah, and one of the things you discover, no matter how clear the author is, you can't fully describe it on paper. So you look for
Exactly.
someone who tries to do that, who makes an attempt that you can read, but when I'm thinking of all those cartoons about physicists up at the blackboard that are all this crappy stuff going on, and then a miracle occurs. Um, because a lot of the times on the outside, that's what it looks like you're doing.
Okay. That you make an excellent point there. Another thing that you touched on with, especially always in the astrology world, how we're always looking for the next new thing. Um, that reminded me of, especially in the earlier chapters of classical solar returns, you make a bunch of really excellent points about using astrology in an ever-changing culture, in an ever-changing world, and how the things that people were dealing with and going through in the earlier years of astrology are culturally just not the same for us today. So, for example, you bring up a really good point about family planning, the choice of whether to have kids or not. Historically, that was never like that much of a choice. It was just something you did, something that happened to you. Now we have a choice. Or I remember another example in your chapter about finances, looking at finances for the solar return, how historically one's wealth is very much tied to land ownership and property or ownership. So it could be more of a fourth house issue and all of that. And so this is another just conundrum I've been exploring in my mind of what does the tried and true look like in that ever changing aspect of our world?
You mean now we're in the year mutation and none of the rules apply? Um, this is, these are exactly the things you have to work out. And these are the things, I think a lot of my approach came from the fact that at the time I was coming up, the fact that I was a lesbian was big news. It was edgy. Um, it made me have to think about minority groups, um, and all these other things, because what it does is it takes you off of not being able to think. And I think it's all these different ways that we just assume that whatever we have is normal, whatever we have is how it's always been. Um, and then you don't ask these questions. And what the questions give you is why something is the way it is. I
Mhm.
mean, and I asked that question there about what's you see somebody, for example, who has, by the old definitions, a very fertile fifth house. Okay. Fifth house fertile, old days, have a lot of kids. Now, you could maybe also then determine, okay, how many of those kids are going to live, which is a question that people rarely ask anymore, but can be true. I mean, there's
Mhm.
certainly a lot of horrible things out there still. Um, but the having a very fertile fifth house in 2024, I mean, this has all just changed since 2020.
Mhm.
And all the stuff going on right now with in vitro fertilization and everything else. Um, these are things that you have to constantly grade in and grade out of. Um, in the old days, if you couldn't conceive naturally, you were just out of luck. You were just out, that's assuming you wanted to have children. You could adopt, but that was the only other option you had. Now How do you even just automatically say, okay, well, now this is how I'm going to see IVF in the chart? The previous generations didn't have to know a formula. Now we can say, okay, well, there's some Uranus going on with the fifth house. Maybe that qualifies. Um, so we're having to take our symbolism and change. To me, that kind of symbolism is so much more significant than say, well, we've got cards. They only had ships, and horses. So, you add a bit of technology and you add technology, but nothing really changed except speed,
Hmm.
or how much of the population has access to it. But these things where you can really do things that you couldn't do before, those are the ones that take some thought. Um, just things, since I spend so much time in Lilly and some of the other 17th century guys, I'm constantly, first of all, they're guys. Um, so that's like the first thing. Would William Lilly have even talked to me seriously? I mean, that's a question.
It's a
Um,
question.
you know, and how would he deal with a multiplicity of relationships? How would he deal with the New York Times constantly throwing up polyamory because they want to have a topic on it because that's how journalism works these days. Um, how do you deal with whatever is the hot topic of your period of time? Um, so this is something, it doesn't really matter whether you're quote a modern astrologer or an ancient astrologer, because the moorings are going to change half a dozen times in your life anyway. And there are going to be points, as I find, where I'm going, I said that because that was the me of 20 years ago or 30 years ago or whatever. And then it seemed relevant. And now it's like, no, not anymore. So these are it's constantly making those judgments about what's the best way to deal with it. It's a question that never ends,
Hmm.
which is why we can keep doing this for the rest of our lives.
Okay. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So basically what I'm getting from that is that the foundations of the astrology remain consistent, but we adapt a little
Mars
bit.
is going to be Mars.
Hmm.
Mars is going to be Mars. Mars is going to do Mars. But what changes is society's attitude about Mars.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Especially with Mars, society's attitude about Mars. Um, yeah, that's just really making me think about history in general, and especially back when astrology was first starting out, having that very Martian warrior type of energy would have been a really good thing in society. And now yes, that's still around, but now it is more about the being able to be diplomatic. That's a little bit more valued, it seems, and just being able to keep the peace. And we actually, speaking of Mars, we did have a really good discussion about Mars when we were discussing this book in book club, but you bring up quite frequently throughout the book because you do have some athlete charts in there about um, how the solar return years where they might have a detriment Mars actually gave them more of a competitive angle, which um, really goes up against some of the stereotypes that we hear about Mars and about just planets in rulership or debilitated planets and all of that. And I was just curious, do you have any thoughts about those traditional types of stereotypes or those stereotypes that go around of oh, you don't have a well-placed Mars, you might be lazy or passive aggressive, versus how they actually operate.
You know, if you go to a gym And a lot of us go to gyms. We should
Hmm.
go to gyms a couple times a week, really. Um, when you hang out in gyms, your daily output is different from day to day. And you come to recognize that. Um, maybe I had a few too many last night. And so now, doing the number of reps or at the way that I normally do it is just a little bit too much today. Um, so first of all, there's that whole thing of we actually are different from day to day.
Hmm.
But with Mars, I think the thing is that the big challenge with Mars is that you've got to get past your fear. You've got to get past your boredom. Now, talk about boredom. What do you do in the gym? You do reps. And if you're going to be an athlete, I remember reading at some point about one of the baseball players who worked out by running up and down in the stadium, all the levels of the stadium. And this is a pro stadium, not a small one.
Hmm.
And I think of that and go, huh, because that's an amazing level of fitness.
It is, absolutely.
And now that's, to me, this is being done for a cause, it's being done for a job, it's being done because they enjoy it. All those are good Mars reasons to do it. But you're going to sweat and you're going to hurt and you're going to sprain yourself periodically. And it's not going to be totally fun, but it's all Mars. I think the thing is that the so many of the really peak sports experiences are peak because you had to work your butt off.
Hmm.
And yes, there are those magic moments where everything just clicks into place and it seems perfect. But we've got the Olympics coming up in a few weeks. And even though there's some amazing talent that's going to be at that, to win, they've still got to cross the hurdles higher and faster than everybody else. And that takes some luck and it takes a lot of training and it takes perseverance and all these things that we know that it takes. And sometimes that Mars and detriment is where that's where you're digging in for that extra shot that you can do, but you can't do it forever.
Hmm.
And I think that's what I realized in working with this material is how frequently that was true. That if everything was clicking and it was too easy, then you didn't have the drive. And drive is so much of this. There's a section in Homer, and it's amazing how so much of our psychology is still the same psychology as Homer's time, really, because we've got the same brains. And there's a section there where they're out on the battlefield at Troy. And these guys out there are basically all in this state where they've gotten themselves worked up into a frenzy. And it's like, I could die in the next 3 seconds, but man, the sunrise looks great. And, it's like you're in this complete state where you're just about as far as you can push yourself. And it's like your senses expand, your mind expands, and you're even outside your body. We call it endorphins, of course.
Hmm.
But it's that idea that sometimes you reach those moments not through it being the most fantastic, but because it's really sloggy and you've pushed through. And this is the reminder to me, a detriment is the same point value as a domicile.
Hmm.
And it's just one feels really good, the other feels, really challenging, but sometimes challenging is what you need.
That does make a lot of sense. It reminds me of, especially in the Kepler fundamentals courses, they really emphasize when it comes to aspects, how especially those squares and those aspects that are that have a lot of fear behind them. People are scared of the red lines, but those aspects are a challenge to overcome and can emphasize great talent in the chart. So it sounds like it's along the same lines with a detriment planet where there's that challenge that might be a little bit harder, but you're not taking it for granted as much as someone who has a lot of ease in those areas might. Okay. And especially just that, this isn't what I'm naturally skilled at, so I have one shot to make it happen. Okay.
And it's also one thing that I would say, and I think it's a huge piece for all of us in terms of thinking about this. A lot of the time, the chart isn't strictly showing talent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm way too short to be an athlete, but I have my Mars in the Copeland sector. So I'm never going to be at the Olympics. I never was at the Olympics. If I'm there, it's going to be because I bought a ticket.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that I can't do. I'm at the gym because I broke my leg a couple of years ago, and it scared the crap out of me. But the thing is that doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it. There's still drive, there's still challenge. And doing physical stuff is intrinsically Mars. So those are things you're going to run into. Um, and so we have to get past thinking about, oh, I have Mars and Scorpio, so I'm really talented at this. No, now you may be talented at fighting, especially the type where you're doing the revenge best eaten cold. But it doesn't necessarily make you a better athlete. What it shows is a level of it shows oftentimes the person's drive, but not the person's talent at it. I think about things like some of the beauty that you can see in somebody doing something physical really well. You're watching something and your jaw's on the floor because it's like, how did they do that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the important thing behind that is, how can they keep doing it? How can they keep doing it? How can they keep a level of 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 facility over time? That's Mars too.
Absolutely. That is, I keep loving what you're saying, how just because the drive is there doesn't necessarily mean that you're talented at it. So I think I'm going to be looking at some things from a new perspective after you said that, especially.
Mhm.
Okay. We do have a question from Peter H from Sweden. Peter wants to know, do you use deacons in the interpretation of natal charts? If so, how do you incorporate them? Additionally, do you follow the Chaldean system or the triplicity method for assigning deacons? What is your reason for your choice?
Since I would describe my method as mostly 17th century Lily astrology. The faces are sometimes called the Chaldean decadence. And so I use that. But for example, the level of description that Austin Coppock gives in his book on the faces is more than I would typically give in a reading, because mostly my readings are not descriptive in that sense. Because what I'm typically doing with my clients, first of all, my biggest group of clients at this point is medical, because that's kind of what I'm known for. So I'm not so much giving readings that say, okay, well, based on these characteristics of your sixth house, these are the diseases you are likely to get. I can do that, but that doesn't interest me. The same way as when I first got into natal astrology, everybody seemed to be doing a reading where they were going, okay, your sun is in Aquarius, that means this. Your Mercury is in Pisces, that means this. Your Mars is in Taurus, that means this. Yuck. Um, I got out of that as fast as I could figure out how to do it. Because I think functionally what you're working with at all times is this is where the client's at right now. They want to know why they haven't got a job right now and when they can get one. They want to know why they don't have a partner and when they can get one. They want to know when they can move out of their parents' house. There's these practical daily kinds of decisions, some of which are life shaking and some of which are boring to anybody else. But those are the things that I tend to work with, is more of these situations of where life is at right now. Now, that's the kind of stuff which is really solar returns are very good for, because you're putting in time goalposts. And so you can look at units of time that are bigger than a day. A year is a convenient unit of time. So those are more of what I'm doing than than what I would call kind of the natal based reading.
Hmm.
Because the thing is, yes, your natal chart is there for all to see and for all of your life. But the things you're emphasizing at any point in time are driven by your circumstance. Look how we all changed during COVID. We had no choice. Okay. We had to adapt to the environment. A lot of things have changed since the mutation in 2020. How well, and the solar returns can help look at this, but how well does your natal chart work in an air environment? How does it work in an air environment compared to how it worked, ED, in an earth environment? And depending on what your elemental breakdown is, how do you adapt from one to the other? People are still doing that. We are not done with 2020.
We're not done with 2020. That makes me think. So a big part of why I especially just really got into astrology. I was into astrology before 2020, but I think for a lot of us who were making that choice to actually study astrology and take astrology courses, 2020 was a big factor in that, and how people just really want to be able to, especially using predictive astrology like solar returns and all of that, just that comfort of being able to get a little glimpse into what might be coming up ahead. It creates that sense of comfort. And I think, especially for like younger people, especially in my generation, there used to be that huge emphasis on the 5 year plan when we're growing up. We have to have our 5 year plan. We're supposed to talk about our 5 year plan in the job interviews. And especially around 2020, I'm like, we're not doing the 5 year plan. There's so much going on that we can't predict. But taking a look at those solar returns of the 5 years, like the next 5 years, I'm able to really go in and see, okay, next year, this is a subject of focus. The year after that, this next thing can be my priority. And so it is really important how astrology is really here to help us adapt, I think, and to one, give us hope, two, help us adapt in the current climate and beyond, hopefully. But yeah, it's super important to remember, yes, we're not done with that, but we do have this wonderful tool to help us look ahead.
Back in 2020, because I'm a medical astrologer, I
Hmm.
got a lot of questions about COVID. And I did a lot of interviews. I recently went back because the question that everybody had. Okay, so we had Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. We had the Saturn Pluto. We had the Jupiter Saturn as part of a mutational shift. Um, Everybody's solar returns in 1999 sucked eggs. I mean, they
Whoa.
basically it basically sucked eggs. It was degree, not with. Which was one of the ways that you could tell that 2020 was going to be a big year even before you got to it.
Hmm.
But the question everybody had then was, when is COVID going to end? And I went back and looked to see what I said because, I was more on top of it then than I am now because it's attenuated. I was saying then and gave the evidence that we would still be largely dealing with COVID in 2024. And that it's only after 2024 that it attenuates. And it's going to be years still before we can stop thinking about it. But 2025 and 2026 are red letter years too, not for as long a period of time as 2020. But they're both going to be very major years. And because it's not a Saturn Pluto, because it's not a Jupiter Saturn, there will be ways that it's shifting off that are different, but there's still going to be those kind of things where you want to know that things are going on. I think this is one of the things that I think there was a lot of tendency in the Earth period to think of everything in a kind of very rational way, but it's a specific rational way. It's an Earth rational way. The
Hmm.
Earth rational way is, if I do this work, if I take this degree, if I, you know, if I perform this labor, which is very Earth, right? Then the following thing will happen. And so I do this, I get that. I do this, this happens. Very predictable. Air is not predictable in the same way. There are currents in air, but the currents are different. They're tendencies. You can't count on the A plus B equals C of the Earth period. This is one of the biggest shifts that everybody is trying to cope with.
Hmm.
And yeah, it was a watershed year for a lot of people studying astrology in understanding that they had less control of their lives than they thought. Now, I think this is a very important thing for us to think about astrologically, because in the Earth period, you could sit there and go, well, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And you could see it in a very linear fashion. But now it's not so linear. You can't count on things to the same degree that you could. We've got to find our languaging way of talking to people about that, because that's what their lives are showing. It's like, on the one hand, there are even more possibilities, and on the other hand, it's like the possibilities are all falling off. It's a very odd mix this period.
It is very odd. And yeah, we are in a period where the things that worked yesterday aren't going to be working out the same way as we do pursuing them today. And yeah, my big conundrum with that is just how can we emphasize that for people? Because I find just talking to people, whether they're an astrology client of mine or not, and I get a little bit radical and I say, hey, we can't build life for us in the same way that our grandparents did. And a lot of people just won't accept that. Yeah, it's definitely a lot to think about. And that emphasis that we are just in a world that's always changing.
That I think is one thing. If you think about the Jupiter Saturns have been the big heartbeat of mundane astrology for centuries. We just entered the air period. The period after the air period is the water period. Those are the two wet elements. Those are the ones that you can't just grab onto and have a sensation of stability. Because the moment, it's like trying to grab onto a cup of water in your hand, it drips out. And this is just the reality. And we're looking at roughly, on one level, on the air level, we're looking at a couple hundred years. If we talk about add the water, for various reasons, astronomically, the water period tends to be the longest one of the four. But so you're looking at roughly 400 years of, and our brains, because we were alive, are now hardwired for the expectation of Earth. And you've had less wiring of it than I've had, but you've had wiring too. And so it's now a question of do you dismantle it? Do you try to paint over it? Do you try to just say, I'm leaving that behind and I'm going over here? It's really tough trying to figure that out. But the first thing you have to do is acknowledge that it changed. Because if you can't get past the acknowledgement stage, you can't get into the process of solving it.
You are absolutely right about that. Patty just sent in a question, which I think we touched on this earlier when we first started. Um, have you done a solar return chart for the USA? I don't know if she means this year, or do you typically look at that in previous years? I know we touched on that a little bit.
I touched on it because the problem with doing that is then you have to decide which USA chart you like.
Mhm.
Personally, I use the Gemini rising chart because that's the oldest chart historically that we have. A lot of people switched to using the Sibley chart about 20 or 30 years ago. The Sibley chart actually is very funny because it occurs in Shibley's book, Cleverly. In the book, there's this lovely engraving of George Washington receiving the chart of the United States from the Roman goddess Fama. It's set for London. Sibley was English. And so, from his standpoint, he saw this as the colonies breaking away from England, not the formation of a new country. So, there's no documentation at all as to what this chart was, what the event was, what the timing was, whether it had anything to do with the US or it only had to do with England. And his whole discussion around it was actually about directing Mars and Saturn to the point where they were at maximum stress, which would, of course, be the point of the break between the two sides. So I don't see that as a historical timing thing. But anyway, whatever chart you use, you would have to do that. Now, the thing is, what the other point of this when you're doing mundane is that they use the Aries ingress, and you use the Aries ingress in the same way that we do when we talk about this as a mundane chart. The chart for the US is a mundane chart, and so I do use the Aries ingress to predict what's going to happen in a year, and I do that more than a solar return of a birth chart because I think the thing is the US doesn't stop at the borders. There's no country in the world right now that can stop at the borders.
Mhm.
I mean, a lot of countries would like to. Portugal's always telling me we're a small country, which means leave us alone. But nobody can be left alone in this world.
Exactly. Yeah, we do live in especially today, the world is so interconnected. It's hard for it to stop
Yeah.
at that borders,
It's,
especially. But Patty, If you're interested in the solar return chart for the US, we do have a webinar on that topic on the 13th, I believe 10 a.m. Pacific. We'll be having a webinar covering that solar return. And if you are interested in more mundane astrology, Lee is actually teaching a course later this month on mundane
Political
astrology
election.
for political for the election year especially. So that might be something you would be interested looking into. I have heard that's only offered once every 4 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, because
Okay.
everybody gets excited in the US election cycle. Here's funny thing.
It's a big topic of focus. Okay. And it looks like those are all of our questions for the day. I should probably cut it off since my dogs were barking like crazy earlier. I'm sorry if everyone heard that. But Lee, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anywhere people can find you to continue following your work, a website you'd like to share or anything?
Well, obviously the Kepler website, because I'm teaching courses pretty much every term now. Um, you'll see my involvement mainly with the medical program because we're just getting that started up. But I teach a
Hmm.
general mundane course in January, most years. And I teach horary courses too. So that's a good place to follow me. Otherwise, my website is leelehman.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us on the 4th of July. And our next book of the month for July is Mutual Reception by Alan Anand. I will be posting a discussion question on that book here in a few days. Let me know in the comments if you are reading along. I know I was slow getting that re-announced, but thank you everyone so much for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.